Hello ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another episode of Sibylline Insights, filmed here in our London studio on the 14th of August. I'm your host, Leo Collins, Sibylline's Intelligence Delivery Lead, stepping in temporarily for Gareth Westwood, who unfortunately cannot be here today. Aiding me in this quest is your co-host and Sibylline's very own North America analyst, Sydney Stewart. Sydney, welcome back.
Thanks, Leo. Nice to be with you today.
Nice to be with you too. And we'll also be chatting to Lily Hood, our new Americas associate, about the strikes that are currently gripping the US. A lot to discuss, but without further ado, what topics will you and I be discussing today?
Well, Leo, you and I will be hitting on the series of indictments of former President Donald Trump.
Excellent. Okay, well, let's kick off then. Trump, a name that we have used so many times over the course of our reporting. What's he done now?
Well, in the beginning of August, Trump faced yet another indictment in the special counsel's investigation, this time into the investigation is ongoing and examining charges that he sought to overturn his loss in the 2020 presidential election. This marked the third court appearance for Trump in recent months, and that is actually likely to be the third out of four. There's also another investigation by the Fulton County District Attorney in Atlanta, Georgia, Fannie Willis. She's expected to bring possible charges against Trump imminently. It was also reported on just last week that they were imposing security measures in Atlanta, in anticipation of a possible charging.
Okay, interesting. So I know that we recently released our Extremism Quarterly, and we focus on, in fact, we use the Trump story as a bit of a segue into far-right extremism and far-left extremism, any sort of consequent far-left activity that might follow far-right activists' actions. But I think let's look at the security aspects of what's going on with Trump. We know from precedent that there is a very fervent echelon within the US society which does resort to violence when it comes to protecting the name and clout of their idolized Trump. Are we likely to see any violence emerge as a result of these developments?
Well, with each subsequent indictment of President Trump, there have been calls online by far-right groups suggesting that they've called for another January 6th. They've made a call to arms and invoked incitements to violence against Department of Justice officials, prosecutors, etc. We have, as of yet, not seen anybody act upon those calls, but it's not without, there remains a possibility that we might see sole perpetrators who've been radicalized to violence. But we're unlikely to see this kind of mass violence and unrest like we did see on January 6th. This is in part due to mentions or beliefs among far-right groups in the US that FBI officials and federal security forces are seeking to entrap them.
Sure.
So we're not likely to see them showing up.
What kind of event would lead to violence, in your opinion?
If Trump should be found guilty, if there's a guilty verdict brought against him in any of these cases, the risk of violence will increase, but especially if he's found guilty in the special counsel's investigation on charges related to the 2020 presidential election. This is, the most contentious of the concurrent cases against him. Recent polling has indicated that the highest proportion of Republican voters and the general public believes that these are the most serious charges compared to all the other cases. So,
and when you say the most serious, you mean these are the charges that Trump supporters are most likely to feel strongly about. They don't necessarily care as much about the possession of classified documents or the hush money paid to the adult film actress. They care more about the context of the overturning of the presidential election charges.
Yes, indeed. But I think it's very important that we draw, a line between supporters of the former president and voters, Republican voters, and of course, when we're speaking about far-right groups and the propensity for violence.
Absolutely. That actually brings me on to my second topic. So we're talking about extremists on the one hand, but also in terms of the context of the 2024 election, what are Republican voters going to make of all this, all of these developments surrounding Trump? Are they going to be alienated from the former president in terms of these mounting embarrassments for him? And are they going to look elsewhere in terms of a Republican candidate, or even their Democratic Republican allegiances?
On the contrary, in some of the recent legal developments, we've seen Trump gain in the polls and also see significant fundraising boosts following the chargings and indictments. So he's actually been able to capitalize and bolster support among the core of Republican voters. However, among persuadable Republican voters and centrists, they've even tended to veer away. So there's definitely a strong possibility for them to be persuaded, but it remains that Trump is dominating in the Republican primary polls.
Sure.
And so at this point, it looks unlikely that any other Republican candidate will supersede him.
Sure. And just going back to the extremism question, in our Extremism Quarterly, we stress the importance of looking at both ends of the political spectrum when it comes to violence. If there is a rise in right-wing extremism and subsequent acts of violence or unrest, are we likely to see a rise in far-left violence as well, in terms of counter-protests at rallies, as an example?
Yeah, so we've seen recently just very low-level protest and counter-protest activity outside of courthouses on the days when he's made an appearance. In the U.S., far-left extremism has been motivated by primarily different factors. There's a growing contingent of the far-left that is focused on both environmental and ecological concerns and anti-police violence. We've seen this in Atlanta in particular with the Stop Cop City movement. Again, Atlanta being a particularly important potential hotspot for unrest.
Sure, and before we move on to our next topic, just to quickly wrap up, in terms of business implications, who should be more concerned right now? Who should be the most concerned in terms of what's going on and the possible ramifications business-wise?
I do think it's too early to say, because the primary implications will be upon, if Trump secures the Republican nomination and then wins in 2024. So I think we're still some ways out from being able to definitively say what are the concrete business implications.
Okay.
Thanks so much, Leo, for such an insightful conversation as always. And now I will be joined by our North America Associate Analyst, Lily Hood, for a discussion on an uptick in labor activity in the US. And now I have the pleasure of being joined by Lily Hood, who is our Associate Analyst for North America, who just joined us recently. Hi, Lily.
Hi, it's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. So I understand you have been covering the uptick in labor activity in the US, particularly in California. What's the general story there?
So this year, it's been called the Hot Labour Summer. There's so much striking activity occurring across the US. There's a few reasons why that's happening. One of the reasons is kind of overspilling grievances from the pandemic. People were really politicised during that time and very much woke up to the fact that they want more from their employers. I would say that's being aggravated by obviously inflationary and socioeconomic pressures. Currently inflation, we're seeing it to amount to about 4.2%, with wages only growing about 3.2%. So obviously there's a big discrepancy there. Interestingly though, another reason why we're seeing quite a big uptick is due to a very tight labour market. People are mostly employed and there's quite a few jobs available. So if striking activity or joining a union does impact their employment, they could just go out and find another job fairly easily. So there's a lot more job security in that sense than there had been previously. And then finally, Joe Biden, he is outwardly claimed to be a very pro-union president, has claimed to be the most pro-union president in history. He's already introduced quite a few measures in August that are kind of very in keeping with this pro-worker agenda. And so, there's so many reasons why we're seeing an uptick.
So on a macro level, we're seeing, the uptick in labor playing into the 2024 presidential election, I'm sure. But before we get to that longer term forecast, I'd love to hear more about labor activity in Los Angeles in particular. I know we've had a lot going on there. But would you be able to speak a little bit about the Hollywood writer strike in particular?
Yeah, sure. So obviously the writer strike has been gaining quite a lot of media attention at the moment. It's predominantly been characterised by the two unions, the Writers Guild of America, the WGA, and SAG-AFTRA, the Actors Guild. So it can be difficult to quantify the impact of striking activity. Often when we hear about these strikes in the news, it's kind of quite difficult to understand, like, well, what is the real impact? Roughly so far, to put it into kind of a quantitative perspective, it cost about $3 billion for the California economy so far, which is obviously extortionate. There's a lot of downstream effects from the striking. Obviously, catering companies who offer catering facilities to production companies, florists, production workers, they're all suffering considerably from the strike. And then also in California, we've seen recently a 24-hour strike of city workers. So that's included traffic wardens, people who work in airports. And then also we obviously had a 3-day strike in March, which involved employers are part of a school union, which saw schools closed for 3 days. So it's very much been gripped by striking activity. I'd say for now, that's probably only going to continue. This month, a Democrat, Southern California Democrat, Anthony Portantino, has indicated that they're looking to push forward legislation which will allow strikers to access unemployment benefits, which is a considerable move. This already exists in other states, but has not existed thus far in California. So if that is implemented, it's likely to see that we'll see a bigger increase.
So that legislation will impact California in particular, is that right? It's in the state. Correct. It's a state legislative proposal?
Yes,
okay.
That's correct.
So rising policy risks for firms and potentially prolonged periods of disruption because workers might be able to sustain even longer strikes. And just kind of a broader ripple effect of rising socioeconomic health risks, as well as things like travel disruption on a very practical level. So how does all of this activity in California kind of relate to the national agenda? Is there an impact on the 2024 election? How does this play for President Biden?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'd say to the short to medium term, we can expect striking activity to remain. As I said before, workers are a lot more politicized. The labour market is strong. And I think they will very much feed into the 2024 elections, where we're going to be seeing Trump and Biden both very much seeking to appeal to workers. Obviously, this pro-union rhetoric is a big part of Biden's brand. Like, Biden economics has always very much kind of galvanized a union discourse, and Trump will very much want to play into that as well. And I think also, we'll see more striking activity simply because we've already seen quite a few wins on that front. Obviously UPS managed to secure quite a significant pay rise and protection for part-time and full-time workers. And then earlier this year, we had the United Americas Airlines. They obtained, I think it was a 40% increase in their salary for 4 years. And then on Friday recently, Hollywood studios have put forward a few concessions to the Writers Guild, and they're considering them. So we're seeing kind of quite a lot of progress being made on that front. And I don't really think that kind of momentum is going to slow down anytime soon. With the elections pending, I think workers and union members will leverage that momentum to push for more gains.
Certainly. And in a place like Pennsylvania, which is, one of the most hotly contested swing states in each election as of late, that, vying for support among workers is going to be extremely, extremely important. So perhaps we will see a hot labor summer give way to 2024 election of the worker, indeed. Well, that's very interesting, Lily. Thank you so much for joining me.
Nice. Thank you for having me.
And thank you so much for joining us today. Remember to please like and subscribe wherever you're finding this podcast, and we look forward to welcoming you back soon.